Joined now by a guy who I don't think he can leave his hotel room. He is Chris Mannix. He is down in Orlando. Chris, am I right? You have to spend, I read your article at SI, a full week without leaving the hotel room, basically, right?
Yeah, you arrive on Sunday, or this past Sunday, and you are sent into your room with instructions not to leave under any circumstances. They drop off food 3 times a day. They left me with a couple of cases of bottled water. If you need more, you just call them and they'll bring them. You know, if you want ice, they'll bring that too. The only time you can really open your door is to get your food and to step kind of into your door frame where they do testing every afternoon. So it's pretty regimented here for the first 7 days.
So you're getting tested every day for the coronavirus, and then I assume they tell you the next day, hey, you passed, or whatever the verdict is?
Yeah, it's usually it's every afternoon or evening, and you usually get the results within 24 hours on an app that the NBA has set up for people inside the bubble. So it's about a 24-hour turnaround.
And for the testing, is this like the nasal swab where they go all the way back up to your brain, basically?
No, thankfully, it's I'm not getting that version. It's a combination nasal and throat swab. They swab both nostrils, and then they swab both sides of your throat. So it's all done within 20 seconds. So it's pretty fast and hopefully, I guess, efficient, so they can make sure everything's set. So
you will be able to leave your hotel room on Monday. Is that right? Is that the way this will work?
I think so. I'm not 100% sure on the timing. You've got to get that last positive test, or last negative test, I should say, from Sunday. And depending on when that comes in, and at that point, I believe we switch hotel rooms again to go to a different portion of the hotel. But it's Sunday night, and we're told that on Monday we can start covering, practices and different things inside the bubble.
So a lot of people have been to Disney World. Are you in a hotel that is isolated from like moms and dads that are taking their kids to Disney World? Like, what hotel are you in? One of the player hotels? How is this set up?
Yeah, I believe. I mean, God, I wouldn't even know who's outside. Like, I have a window that faces a hallway, so occasionally there's some foot traffic going back and forth. But we're in the Coronado Springs Hotel, which is on the Disney campus, and I believe it's inside the bubble, and you don't have that foot traffic because I'm also sure it's connected to one of the player hotels. So I can't imagine the NBA would have that be the case. So I think it's fairly isolated from everybody else.
How many guys are like you in the NBA media community?
Inside the bubble?
Yes.
There's about 10 of us, and several of us, myself included, will swap out with somebody else in September. Some of them will be here the entire time. I find that daunting, to say the least. But there's about 10 of us that are in here kind of interacting via text messages. And they have semi-regular Zoom calls with league officials to kind of talk about the next steps and talk about what we can and can't do. So we try to stay in contact, but at this point, I mean, look, Joe Barden from The Athletic is right down the hall from me. I couldn't even step out to wave at this point without risking, wind up in another quarantine like some players have been.
Yeah, so let's go to that. What are players doing right now? Like, so if players leave the campus, like we've seen happen a couple of times, I believe now, they get quarantined, and this is not an enjoyable thing, right? Like, you're not allowed to leave your room or have contact with anybody else for a full week. Most people haven't done that. It's a form of imprisonment in some way. Now, I'm sure, they're bringing you food. It's not an awful thing, but you can't go to the gym. You can't, you can't even step outside. You said you don't even have a window to look outside. I mean, do you feel claustrophobic at all?
A little bit. I mean, God, I lived in New York for 15 years, so it's not that much different from what I experienced for a long time. But it is starting to resemble my college dorm room in here with kind of clothes on the floor and, like food containers lying around everywhere. It's pretty nasty. But the players, I felt that in addition to being the mandatory punishment for players that violated the rules. What happened with Bruno Caboclo of the Rockets and Richaun Holmes of the Sacramento Kings, I felt like as much as it was to punish them, it was a message that the NBA was sending. Like, don't screw around with this. Like, if you leave this campus or if you step outside our kind of bubble here, you're going to get nailed for it. And if you get nailed, you have to spend 10 days inside your hotel room. And not only will you have to deal with it, but your team has to deal with it. They're not going to have you at practice. You're not going to be part of, the build-up. In Sacramento is trying to make the playoffs here. Like, Richaun Holmes is a role player on that team. So I think that was a message the league was trying to send, that this is not just lip service. We're not going to give you second chances. The integrity of this bubble is all that matters to us right now.
So a couple of things. I'm sure you probably saw that the MLS had initial bubble-related issues. Now it seems like they've basically wiped the virus clean. As you look at the incredibly detailed specifications the NBA has followed, and now that you're a part of it, are you more optimistic maybe than you were before about the NBA's ability to pull this off?
Yeah, and you hate to kind of get Stockholm syndrome.
Yeah, right.
Here when you're like, well, it's like, wow, this is great. The protocols are intense. There's no way this bubble can be penetrated. But the reality is, I mean, it's pretty, like you said, it's pretty detailed. It's comprehensive, and it's as close to airtight as you can get. So I think for the short term, yeah, I'm pretty confident that everything is going to start on time. You've had 2 players test positive since they got to Orlando, and neither one of those players had stepped out of their initial quarantine. Players and coaches, when they get here, have to go through about a 36-hour quarantine. And in that window, that's when the 2 players the NBA announced were tested positive. So they haven't had any players test positive since they left their rooms and got into the bubble. The MLS situation, the NBA wasn't all that worried about because MLS made what I thought was a pretty big mistake in having scrimmages before they got down to Orlando. And that's a easy kind of event to potentially spread coronavirus. The NBA, their players prior to getting here, they were only allowed to do individual workouts. There was no 3-on-3s or 5-on-5s. There was no 1-on-1s. It was just shooting drills with an assistant coach who had to be wearing a mask at all times. So, I think the NBA prepared for this properly by not, putting themselves in a bad position before they got to Orlando.
So what will you consist of once you can step outside of your room? Do they give you a detailed list of when players and teams are practicing and you can just show up and go sit in the crowd and watch this? Do you know exactly what your day-to-day will be? Obviously, once the games start, I'm assuming you'll get a roster of those. But do you have access basically to go watch any basketball game you want?
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to practices, you have the ability to do what media does traditionally with NBA practices. You can't watch the whole thing, but you can get there and watch the final 15 minutes of it. And theoretically, you can ask for and get one-on-ones with certain players. Now, they'll have to be socially distanced. You can't just, sidle up to a guy like many of us are used to and have a conversation. Everything's got to be done through team and league PR officials. But theoretically, you can, sit down at a table and do an interview with a player. And there's obviously huge value in that, given that everything being done right now is via Zoom. The other huge advantage is when it does come to game times, you can go to pretty much every game that you want to, and you're going to see and hear things that we've never heard before.
Yeah.
I mean, the bubble seats are going to be right courtside, and you're going to be able to hear coaching instructions, player interactions, referee interactions. I think, look, you want to be able to tell deep, rich stories, but I think every day what I'm probably going to do is just going to write the sights and sounds of what I'm seeing on that court, what players are saying and how they're interacting and what they look like, and really everything you can pick up that ordinarily we never get to pick up.
When you look at the larger universe, I mean, I know you couldn't have missed it, the Adrian Wojnarowski story, which brought up back into the storylines, the NBA, Hong Kong, China. Do you expect the league to address that in any way? Do you expect players to address that in any way?
I mean, maybe. Like, there's the ability for them to be asked the questions every single day. It's possible. I'm assuming at some point that Adam Silver is going to have a press conference for all the media prior to the restart of the season, as he often does before events like this. When it comes to the the Hong Kong and China stuff. The one thing I've asked, it just seems at this time it's a solution without a problem yet. Like, no player has asked to wear any of that on jersey. And look, if somebody does and the NBA says no, that's a different conversation. But up until this point, and I've asked league officials, I've asked player agents, I've asked players themselves, if anybody had wanted to do it, and I've yet to hear of any player that wants to wear it. So if it comes to that point, I think it's worth talking about. But if no player's looking to do it, I don't know exactly what the discussion is supposed to be.
Do we know what rejected terms players wanted on their jersey and the NBA said no to?
I don't know. Here's the thing. I don't know that they said no to anything, but the mistake they made was not being more inclusive with the process. And it flabbergasted me that they didn't involve LeBron James in it. I mean, he's the biggest star in the NBA. You should, bring him into that discussion. But in their discussions, they negotiated them with Chris Paul of the union, with Michelle Roberts of the Players Union, and this is what they came up with.
Doesn't it surprise you, by the way, that Chris Paul, who's supposedly good friends with LeBron James, wouldn't have had a conversation with LeBron about what he might want on his jersey?
I just don't think that – I guess at the time, and I have a sort of a cursory understanding of what went on there, but I guess at the time it wasn't really – they thought this would suffice. They thought this would be this list was solid. But the reality is they probably should have involved – not just LeBron, but the rank and file. I mean, immediately you heard Jaylen Brown say, I wish I was more involved. Mike Scott, called it a big miss. Like this, they clearly should have brought more people into the loop. And these guys, I don't think these guys would have come up with something that the NBA wouldn't have wanted. I just don't think they involved enough people in this process.
And they certainly opened the door to asking about political questions when you take any kind of statement like this and put it on a jersey, right?
Yeah, I mean, yes. Look, and we've talked about this before. I mean, I think the NBA, they have made a conscious decision to, offer the full-throated support for the Black Lives Matter movement. And there's going to be backlash to that from some corners, and there's going to be issues like we're running into right now with what players can wear and what they can't wear. But this is kind of the decision the NBA's made, and they've decided they'll deal with any of the fallout.
We're talking to Chris Mannix at SI Chris Mannix on Twitter. How will you get to the games? Do you have a driver? Is there a bus that leaves every day? Like, I'm kind of fascinated with the mechanics because theoretically they're trying to limit your interaction as well. Are there drivers in the bubble? Like, do bus drivers have to stay in the bubble? Like, I'm utterly fascinated by all the mechanics involved here. Yeah,
I believe they're van drivers that just sort of pick up the approved media members and drop them off at a certain location. Because you're right, the NBA does not want the media, stepping outside of the boundaries. And believe me, once I find out what those boundaries are, I'm not going anywhere near them to do this again. But there's going to be a van driver of some kind that picks you up at a specified location and will take you directly to the entrance you're supposed to enter. And look, before you can even. Like, one thing about these magic bands the NBA asks you to wear, makes you wear, they're tied to this app that the NBA has you download. On this app, you have to do like 10 different things before you get access to anything. You have to take your temperature. You have to put a pulse oximeter on your finger. You have to do, I'm just looking at the pile of crap that's in front of me right now that I have to go through before I can even get access. So if you try to wave that magic band at a checkpoint where approved media is supposed to be allowed to go through and you haven't gone through your protocols, it'll beep red. You won't be allowed into that area. So you have to go through a pretty extensive checklist, which includes that, going to your daily testing, everything before you can even access an arena or a practice.
2 weeks until games basically start. I'll ask you this question, which we've been asking you for a while. Appreciate the time. Who do you think should be favored? What do you think as you're now down there hearing and maybe talking with people about the bubble environment? How would you assess the race for the championship from Orlando?
Yeah, there's a lot more buzz amongst coaches that I've talked to about the Clippers at this point. I mean, we don't want to overestimate the loss of guys like Avery Bradley and Rajon Rondo because they're not LeBron and Anthony Davis, and those are the drivers of that team. But when you deplete your backcourt like that, and you're dusting off, Dion Waiters and J.R. Smith for potential minutes, that's a problem. And the Clippers, by all accounts, they're healthy down here. Kawhi, from what I hear from early practice singular, is in pretty good shape. So there's the sense that the Clippers are going to be more ready to pick up where they left off than the Lakers are because of that depleted backcourt. But again, we've said this before, like those scrimmages start on the 22nd. That's when we're really going to get a look at this, because right now everything is awesome. Everybody is in shape. Everybody's ready to go. Those scrimmages are going to reveal where players are at this stage of the season.
How serious do you think that Rondo injury is for the Lakers, and both also for his ability to come back?
Well, if you know anything about Rondo's career, 6 to 8 weeks is laughable. Like, the guy played through a broken arm in a playoff game when Dwayne Wade took him out 7 or 8 years ago. I mean, this guy plays through pain as well as any player I've ever seen. So I would expect him to be back close to the 4-week range, which will put him right around the start of the playoffs, maybe a little bit into it. It's not as significant as Bradley. I mean, Rondo was not having a great season this year, but he is a ball handler, and that puts more pressure on LeBron to be the primary ball handler in addition to scoring and facilitating. So, there's that part of it. But I look at Avery Bradley as being a much more significant injury. That's an on-ball defender. If they wind up playing Portland in the first round, you ask me what games I'd be going to, I'm going to that series every single time, because the Blazers with Lillard and McCollum could eat up that backcourt. They've got two guys that were done for the year back in March that are playing in Yusuf Nurkic and Zach Collins. So, I mean, that's a team in a matchup I would love to see in the first round.
Outstanding stuff. He's Chris Mannix at SI Chris Mannix. Enjoy the rest of the lockdown, and we'll talk to you next week.